Good morning. Thanks for joining us for today's webinar, a look at goosegrass control in cool season turfgrass, presented by PBI-Gordon with Matt Elmore, Ph.D. My name's Lisa Wick. I'm the Senior Manager of E-Learning Programs and will be today's moderator. A couple of quick housekeeping notes before I turn things over to Matt. We are recording today's event. You'll receive access to that recording as part of a follow-up email. Your audio is muted in this system, but we do encourage you to ask questions as we go along. To do that, you can raise your hand on the GoToWebinar control panel. There's a tab that has an orange rectangle at the top. At the bottom, there's a raise hand icon. You can click that and I can unmute you at an appropriate time and you can ask your question. Or inside the control panel, there's a question answer box and you can type your questions there and we can get them addressed in that way. That would also be where you would see the handouts, a couple of which are available to you to download. Today's session is eligible for GCSAA external education points. At the end of the program, we'll give you a code that you can input on the association's website. We hope you'll find today's webinar valuable. It's brought to us in partnership with PBI-Gordon. With a full line of herbicides, insecticides, fungicides, growth regulators, and other products, PBI-Gordon Corporation is a national leader in the professional turf and ornamental management industry. Today's presenter is Matt Elmore, Ph.D., who's an Assistant Extension Specialist in Weed Science, Turfgrass, Landscapes, Pastures, and Forages at Rutgers University. He earned his bachelor's at Penn State, master's and Ph.D. at the University of Tennessee. Prior to joining Rutgers, Elmore had an extension appointment at Texas A&M University, where his research efforts explored new strategies to control problematic weeds and reduce irrigation inputs in turfgrass. His program at Rutgers focuses on novel strategies to control weeds with fewer pesticide inputs and better understand the influence of management practices on weed competitiveness. Elmore has been a GCSAA member for 11 years and has taught both seminars and webinars for the association. Please join me in welcoming today's presenter, Matt Elmore, Ph.D. Matt?
Thanks, Lisa. Yeah, it's good to be here, everyone. Thanks for taking the time to come out and talk with me about goosegrass. So, the reason we're talking about goosegrass is it seems like it's just becoming more of a problem in cool season turf. As Lisa mentioned, before I started here in New Jersey, I was in Texas and before that in Tennessee. And goosegrass has historically, I think, been more of a problem in the southeastern United States. And so I think there have been a lot of strategies developed for goosegrass control in warm season turf. One of the things I realized when I got here is that goosegrass has become, especially in the mid-Atlantic and the parts of the Northeast, has become a major issue in cool season turf as well over the last, maybe it sounds like 10 or 15 years. I know whenever I went through school as an undergrad, there wasn't a whole lot of talk about goosegrass as a weed, and now, again, it seems like it's becoming more of a problem. So for the first few years here, my program has been working a little bit to try and understand it and try to develop practical strategies for control. So some of what we'll talk about today is sort of, tools that maybe have been around for a while, and we took a new look at them, and some of what we'll talk about is new stuff. So, the first thing though that I think is important to talk about with goosegrass is really just identification, because it's one of those things I didn't learn a whole lot about it in school, and for those that have been in the industry longer than I have, there probably was not a whole lot of talk about it either. So, the biggest thing is just learning how to identify it. So for a lot of you that have had it for a while, probably not going to have much of a problem identifying it, but as it continues to move into new areas, moves farther north, it seems like, or maybe onto golf courses where it wasn't previously a problem, it's just important to ID it and to differentiate it from crabgrass. So here's a picture of goosegrass with that sort of herringbone seed head shape you can see on the lower left-hand corner of the screen, and again, it can become a problem in putting greens and a lot of our high-value turf areas. So I'm going to try to advance this slide here. All right, so again, we'll talk about life cycle and then a little bit more about identification. But it's a warm season annual weed, and so it germinates after crabgrass. So keep that in the back of your mind as we're talking about control strategies and life cycles and whatnot today. It really, especially in cool season turf, can really take over, in the middle of the summer when the growth, those cool season grasses start to slow. So here's actually a golf course fairway, and hopefully you can see it's infested pretty heavily with goosegrass. So the white hue, the white casting across the fairway is actually because the goosegrass in this fairway has been treated with Pilex, and so it's displaying some of that symptomology associated with that herbicide. But really what to see is, if left unchecked, this weed can become a serious problem in fairways. And one of the things we've noticed is it seems to be more of a problem in ryegrass fairways than bentgrass. And hopefully you can actually see from this photo, and maybe I'll try to draw it here, but you can see these patches here, and these are actually bentgrass patches in this fairway. So again, it seems to be more of a problem in ryegrass than bentgrass, although bentgrass gets it too. I think it just has to do with the fact that bentgrass can develop a bit of a thatch layer, things like that, but we don't really know why. But again, it seems to be more of a problem in ryegrass. So see if I can flip forward here. So why are we having problems with goosegrass, I guess? Why is it becoming more of a problem, and why do we have infestations on golf courses? Well, one of the things is it's a new weed problem, so we'll talk a little bit more about identification, but it could be one of those things that just kind of sneaks in, and you sort of look at it as, well, maybe that crabgrass control didn't work, and the weed problem kind of compounds on itself year after year as the deposits seed at the end of the year for the next season's crop. So that could be part of the problem, is identification and letting small infestations just kind of fester and again produce a lot of seed that then can explode when we get years like 2017, for example, where we have lots of high temperatures and heavy rainfalls throughout the late summer that can cause that weed problem that's sort of been festering, I guess you could say, a little bit to kind of explode. So that could be one of the things we're seeing. We'll talk about the rest of these today, but we'll talk about different pre-emergence herbicides, the right timing for those pre-emergence herbicides, and some post-emergence programs, and also some cultural practices and things you want to think about maybe if you've got a goosegrass problem. So we'll delve into this first topic a little bit, a new weed problem, right? So we talked about, again, just in the previous slide, some of the weather conditions that we've had, some rough summers over the past couple of years, again, especially 2017. The other thing that might be causing an increase in the amount of goosegrass we're seeing is something that's been happening over a longer period of time, a number of years, where we've seen a decrease in herbicides like MSMA, especially in the southeast, that really control a lot of different weeds, maybe controlling weeds that we weren't necessarily even targeting. So MSMA, if you were applying it for crabgrass, well, you might have actually been getting goosegrass control from that herbicide as well. And the other thing is, this MSMA use or decrease in MSMA use and other kind of more broad spectrum herbicides, older herbicides have been replaced with the pre-emergence herbicides as we know them today, dimension, prodiamine or barricade, and pendimethalin. And those have been used for the last 20 or 30 years, and so continued use of those has potentially led us to this problem where they provide excellent crabgrass control, but not all pre-emergence herbicides are going to work as well in crabgrass as goosegrass and vice versa. So we'll talk a little bit about that. But essentially what we're using now more often than not are herbicides, again, with a limited spectrum of weed control. So it's important to think maybe a little bit programmatically, or think about what weed pests you have on the golf course, and maybe what herbicides you might want to select based on those weed problems, instead of just thinking, well, I got my pre-emergence out for grassy weed control. It's actually, we'll see a little different depending on whether you have crabgrass or goosegrass. So again, proper identification is important. In the big picture on the left side of the screen here, what you have are two different summer annual grasses. So the one on the left is crabgrass, specifically smooth crabgrass here. So you hopefully you can see that the purplish stems on the smooth crabgrass, and that's probably one of the most common weeds that's been around for years in the northeastern United States and mid-Atlantic. And then goosegrass is pictured here on the right. You can see the stems of goosegrass compared to crabgrass are white, and they're also typically more flattened, and the stems of the smooth crabgrass on the left are going to be rounded. Another dead giveaway is the seed head. We saw this earlier. That's the goosegrass seed head on the seed head, excuse me, on the lower right-hand corner of the screen. The seeds are kind of arranged in that zipper pattern or that herringbone pattern, whereas the seed head of smooth crabgrass on the upper right-hand corner of the screen it looks a lot different. So again, the difference between these two weeds and being able to identify them is important because their life cycles are relatively similar, and that they're going to look, they're going to get pretty big in the middle of the summer and then start to produce seed, later in the summer. And that seed will of course be next year's crop. So we'll move ahead here. So we've got a poll before we get too much more into it. We're going to start talking about pre-emergence herbicides next. So I think it looks like it popped up there. So the question is, where is goosegrass most problematic for you? Specifically, what areas of the golf course? Greens, fairways, roughs, or tees? And so I guess we'll take a second to answer that. And then whenever, Lisa, do you pull that down off the screen, or how do we do that?
I do. We didn't talk about this earlier, Matt, but I can see in my top secret little viewer here what % of the audience has voted, as well as what amount of time has passed. And so I wait until most of the votes are coming in. We got a lot of people today, yeah. Hence the popularity or unpopularity, I guess, of goosegrass.
Yeah. I always have to be careful when I go to a golf course and there's a good goosegrass infestation, because it's usually exciting for me, but then you realize I'm not the one that has to manage it every day. So it's potentially a good research site, but
yes, I can see how I've heard Ben McGraw say the same thing about the annual bluegrass weevil infestations.
Yeah.
And when they were spreading more, which apparently goosegrass has done a similar type of thing.
Yeah, it seems like it. So whenever you think everyone's voted, we can go ahead and move.
All right, closing the poll in 5, 4, 3, 2, and this.
Okay. Greens, fairways, pretty equal split. All right. Sounds good. We'll talk a little bit about putting greens, and then we'll also talk a lot about fairways and roughs, and then some of that can apply to tees. So that helps me. So thanks everybody. All right. So we'll talk about pre-emergence herbicides. I should probably have titled this, maybe optimizing your pre-emergence herbicide. I don't want to say that we've been applying an incorrect pre-emergence herbicide, but maybe there are some that are a little bit better than others, or we can tweak things a little bit when we know we have a goosegrass problem. So that's what I'll talk about next. And so when we're thinking about the big picture of pre-emergence herbicides, they're thought to germinate about 4 weeks after crabgrass. So we have to think about that, and the residual of these pre-emergence herbicides that we apply for crabgrass, is it enough to make it through the season for goosegrass? That's one thing to think about, and why maybe we're having problems with our pre-emergence crabgrass programs really not holding up for goosegrass. So again, do they not have enough residual? I think another big thing is the combination of traffic. Typically goosegrass starts in really highly trafficked areas with thin turf grass. And so the thing to keep in mind is our pre-emergence herbicide programs really are not designed to hold up in a situation where you've got really thin turf grass throughout the summer. They're really designed to get you, a certain number of weeks into the summer, and then if you have turf grass that thins out later in the summer, you're likely to need to rely on other strategies for control. So if you've got, again, thin turf throughout the season, that's just going to put a lot more pressure on your pre-emergence herbicide, and so going to likely cause failure. So trying to think about how you can manage traffic, potentially increase the growth of that turf grass to complement that pre-emergence herbicide is going to be important. But the product selection is also important. And so if you look at goosegrass control for some of these product labels, if you're going to use this product, in this case Dimension, to control goosegrass, what is recommended on the label? And this is coming from research that's been done over the years, and you'll see it's quite a bit different from what they would recommend for crabgrass control, for example. And so Dimension is a popular herbicide in the Northeast, so is barricade prodiamine. And they provide excellent crabgrass control, and you can get pretty good crabgrass control. It depends on location, but typically you would apply either a 1/4 pound per acre, maybe 0.38 pounds, or up to a 1/2 pound of Dimension active ingredient per acre throughout the course of the year. But what you'll see is here for goosegrass, what they're recommending is that basically you come out and you apply a 1/4 pound per acre shortly after crabgrass is going to emerge, or around when it germinates, and then come back later in the season and apply a 1/2 pound per acre for a total of 3/4 pound. So that's quite a bit of active ingredient, and maybe is sort of an indicator that if you want to use this product for goosegrass control, you know, it's not maybe quite as effective on goosegrass as it is on crabgrass, simply because you're looking at how much you have to apply here. And this might not be something a lot of us want to do, is applying 3/4 pound of Dimension on fairways, especially bentgrass fairways. And the same thing is true for the prodiamine label, the barricade label. It again suggests a similar thing where, it's basically suggesting you apply maybe a lot more than you typically do for crabgrass, and this may be more than you're comfortable applying depending on the turf species. So we want to think about other things. So we've been doing some work over the last couple years looking at some of these different programs of the thiopure and prodiamine. These were kind of designed around bentgrass fairways and fairways in general, cool season fairways, and compared that to oxidizon. And oxidizon is Ronstar, which is a herbicide known to be very effective against goosegrass. It was developed in the 80s, and there was some work done in cool season turfgrass back then, but it didn't really seem to, the product didn't really seem to catch on, possibly because goosegrass just was not a huge problem back then. So a lot of this is kind of looking at an herbicide that's been around for quite a while. So these are, and you don't need to get too hung up on the rates here necessarily. What I do want to focus on is just the comparison between the products and also the comparison between the locations. So in 2018, we did this on a golf course in central New Jersey and also on the research farm. So these treatments were applied pre-emergence to goosegrass. So we actually applied them in early May. Both places were perennial ryegrass with severe infestations of goosegrass in the past. So we applied these products as you typically would, as a granular for Ronstar and liquids for the others, watered them in right after, all that good stuff. And so we were either looking at single applications, as in the case of here, or if you see this followed by, that means there was an initial application in May and another one 6 weeks later. So again, don't need to get too hung up on the rates though right now. There are the formulations there. The thing to remember with Ronstar is it needs to be applied as a granular to dry turf. The sprayable formulation should not be available for most of us in cool season turf country, but you definitely do not want to spray this product or you'll have severe turf injury. So we used a granular product. So here's what we saw when we applied these treatments at the research farm. This is goosegrass control in August of 2018, so we're getting near the end of the summer, and this is when we typically like to evaluate our pre-emergence herbicides. And what you kind of see is a couple things. You see these asterisks on top here. These denote a statistical difference between this group of 6 bars on the right and the group of 4 bars on the left. So what we're looking at is percent control from 0 to 100 of goosegrass, again, at the end of the summer. So 100% control is excellent. That's no goosegrass in the plot. 0% is it looks exactly like our non-treated control that we have. So we're kind of comparing everything that way. And what you see is we make a single application of dithiopure in the spring at a 1/2 pound. We got, in this case, about 20% control. In some years it might be a little higher, but this isn't too far away from what we'd expect typically. A split application, which is what is recommended on the label, is here. That's going to provide more control. But if you compare that to the goosegrass control provided by oxidizon with these stars above the bars here, there was a clear difference where if we apply oxidizon, we get more goosegrass control. And this really isn't much of a surprise, right? It's pretty well known that oxidizon provides better goosegrass control than some of the other products. So there's the amount of control we saw, right? Significant differences, but not huge differences, especially when we compare it to the golf course that we'll see in a minute. And I'll just put up some pictures here of those, the control we saw, mostly just so that you kind of get an idea of the pressure we had at the site, and that can maybe help you compare the results across trials and maybe compare to what might happen at your golf course, right? So the dithiopyr is providing some control, and if you have low-level infestations at your golf course, the dithiopyr has likely held those back for many years and may still continue to do so. But when you get heavy infestations like when we can create at the research farm or that we've seen on some golf courses in New Jersey, the product might not work quite as well. Again, still an excellent product for crabgrass control, just it depends on the level of an infestation again. So here we have a Ronstar treated plot on the right where there's obviously less goosegrass there. So we also did this on a golf course, and the golf course had a severe infestation in the fairway. They had been using dithiopyr or also barricade for many years. They were also following that with a low rate acclaim program in the summer, so they were applying acclaim every 2 to 3 weeks to try to manage the goosegrass that way. But they were having trouble, and this program seemed to be increasingly less effective as they went through the years. So when we did the same trial at the golf course that we just looked at the research farm, we got dramatically different results. So what we have here is, again, the same graph, percent control. In this case, we've got the letters to denote statistical differences. But the biggest thing to focus on is the dithiopyr and prodiamine provided essentially no control, right? So we're looking here on the left side of the screen. So almost no control provided by those herbicides, regardless of application regimen. When we compare that to Ronstar, where there was excellent goosegrass control provided, really regardless of rate, and we got a little bit more control from split applications, but that's not the focus here. So what's interesting is, right, at a golf course where they've been using the same herbicide for many years, there's significantly less goosegrass control. So it starts to make you wonder about resistance. So we'll talk about that a little bit. But basically, that's the amount of control we saw. So a little scary, right? And so we look at the goosegrass infestation at the golf course. Hopefully this is showing up well here. On the left, you've got your non-treated control. This is mid-August. And remember, 2018 was a really wet year, really humid conditions through August, really tough on ryegrass as Gary leaf spot. We had a record August in terms of rainfall. So that was good for this trial. Probably not so good for the golf course in general, but again, here's the level of goosegrass infestation that we saw. So most of the green that you see in this picture is actually goosegrass. So we've got the non-treated on the left, dithiopyr on the right. Hard to really differentiate those two. When we compare that to oxidizon, you can see there were a few goosegrass escapes in there at 3 pounds, but a significant improvement in terms of control. And so the thing to keep in mind is that basically what we saw, keeping this in mind as we move forward, is that we got moderate control provided by dithiopyr and prodiamine at a research farm where we had not previously tested herbicides in this area. And then we got good to excellent control provided by the Ronstar oxidizon at all the sites. But what was most interesting is that there was no control provided by the dithiopyr and prodiamine on the golf course we looked at here. We also did this work at another nearby golf course in 2017 and got nearly the same result. So a little scary. Again, what we start to think about is resistance, because oxidizon has a different mode of action than dithiopyr and prodiamine. So again, that was what we were starting to think about here, but you can't really use just a field trial to confirm herbicide resistance. So we took it into the laboratory. We took the plants from the golf course, collected seed from those plants, and compared them to our research farm population and another known susceptible population. Basically what we did was we spiked petri dishes with herbicides at different concentrations, dimension, or dithiopyr and prodiamine, and planted seeds and looked at the root growth and how those seedlings developed, right? And so we know our pre-emergence herbicides, dithiopyr and prodiamine, are going to inhibit root growth. And so you can see that on the left here. This is the response we would expect. You can see those seeds there. Actually, there's actually a tiny little shoot meristem that's emerged, but what you'll see is it's not actually growing. The cells can't divide because of that herbicide. So we've got germination but no growth, and that's what you would typically see in the field. On the right side, we've got our golf course population. and that was largely unaffected by the dithiopyr as you see on the right. So the roots were growing normally, the plants were growing normally. So basically what we have at this point is we've confirmed resistance to dithiopyr on this golf course that's been using the same herbicide, right, the same mode of action for many years.
And Matt,
Yep.
just so I understand, those were treated with the same kind of rate, correct?
Yes, yeah, good question. So both petri dishes in this picture have the same concentration of dithiopyr in that media, in that gel that you see there. So what we do is we mix up a solution basically of this gel with herbicide in it and let it harden in these plates, and then we plant them. So the roots are basically growing through this gel that's spiked with herbicide. And so what, again, you would expect to see is what we see on the left, where the roots just can't grow and the plants develop. So
thank you.
That's a good question. So, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say thank you.
Oh, yeah, sure. So what we've learned here, and we don't know how widespread this resistance is at this point. It's just the first two golf courses I did goosegrass work on after arriving at Rutgers in New Jersey both have resistance. So we've confirmed resistance at both golf courses. Again, these were fairways, we're not in putting greens here, but golf courses that had fairly widespread infestation. So we don't know the extent of this. I think, the herbicide selection is something we'll talk more about, but it's going to be an important component. Right now, we've got, I think, 20 goosegrass populations where we collected in 2019 from various golf courses. And so what we're trying to figure out is this resistance to these mitotic inhibiting herbicides like dithiopyr, prodiamine, and pendimethalin, is it very widespread, or did we just randomly walk on two golf courses with resistance? So we don't know the answer to that yet. We're actually screening them in the greenhouse right now. So, the question I guess you might have is whether you have resistance or not. And I don't really have a good answer for that question. It's one of those things where if you've seen widespread failures for maybe several years that seem to be expanding, it's something to certainly think about, whether or not you want to rotate and think about using Ronstar or oxidizon, because one, it's more effective on goosegrass, and two, it has a different mode of action to help us manage this resistance. Because goosegrass, unlike crabgrass, which we'll talk about now, goosegrass seems to have a greater propensity to acquire these mutations that are going to confer herbicide resistance. So with crabgrass, we've been using pre-emergence, the same ones for many years, and really not had any problems. It just depends on the weed and the biology of the weed and whether or not it can, it's prone to these mutations. So goosegrass has shown itself in warm season turf, especially, to be prone to these mutations. We just haven't seen it much in cool season turf. So the thing to think about is if you saw those results, you might think, well, I probably need to adopt, an oxidizon program on the golf course, potentially. And so one of the things I would just want to talk about here is how that would affect crabgrass control, because dithiopyr and prodiamine and others are outstanding crabgrass control products. So we did some trials in 2018, 2019 looking at similar programs, except instead of goosegrass, we're looking at crabgrass control, right? And so what we found is that, not a huge surprise, is that dithiopyr provides outstanding crabgrass control. So, you see these asterisks here in the blue bars on the left, providing, more than 90% crabgrass control here, and that's what we would expect. And so if you apply oxidizon by itself, and that's in these red bars, oxidizon by itself is going to provide less crabgrass control. So what we've been looking at is lower rates of dithiopyr in combination with oxidizon. And so in this case, we found that those actually provide comparable crabgrass control to dithiopyr at higher rates applied by itself. So, there's a lot to unpack here, I guess, in terms of herbicides and rates and things, but something to keep in mind is that you don't want to completely abandon your dithiopyr program or your crabgrass pre-emergence program because you've now got goosegrass, because if you completely switch to oxidizon, you might end up with a crabgrass problem again. So if there's any questions about rates or anything, I'm happy to talk about it, but I want to spend more time talking about just some of the bigger concepts. And so here are some pictures of that research, right? So the dimension split application there on the left, which is going to provide, nearly 100% crabgrass control in most years, compared to oxidize on the right. So the results are almost flipped compared to the goosegrass. All right. So we'll talk about oxidize on a little bit. I've kind of mentioned this, but it is a different mode of action than the pre-emergence herbicides that most of us are probably familiar with in cool season turfgrass. So it does not inhibit root growth. It's actually what's called a PPO inhibitor. So it's similar to sulfentrazone or carfentrazone, except that it has a lot more soil activity. So basically, as the shoot grows up through the soil on a new seedling, that shoot will be impacted by the herbicide, and that'll kill the plant. Whereas the other herbicides, dithiopyroprodiamine, are going to inhibit root growth. So, just like we mentioned earlier, you don't want to apply this product to wet turf. You want to apply it to granular, to dry turf, and water it in. And I'm sure your industry salespeople and whatnot, if they sell these types of products, will be happy to give you the finer details on that. Currently, I guess in terms of recommendations and rates, my recommendations are just to start it, if you've never used this product before, to start at a single application in the spring. We'll talk about timing later, around 2 pounds per acre. Sometimes we see injury if we get up at 4 pounds or above on creeping bentgrass. It's pretty transient. It would be a little bit of yellowing that would go away fairly quickly. But if you're using this, applying it with a rotary spreader, if you just start at 2 pounds, that'll give you usually pretty good efficacy, and you don't have to worry about overlaps at that rate.
And since you're talking about rates, Matt, this would be the part where I say the label is the law. You've got a nice shot there. You got to make sure that you know what the label says for your location and that you apply accordingly. Also, the researchers, you guys can vary, but none of the recommendations that you have for us today would be off-label, right?
That's correct. So 4 pounds per acre is the maximum yearly application rate for oxidizon. So 2 pounds is under that, and that's, with some of the efficacy data we've found, we have, that seems to be a good place to start. I'm not saying you're going to get 100% control at 2 pounds, but yeah, that's right, Lisa. Everything today is going to be legal applications. So
excellent. Thank you.
That covers it. Yeah. So there's a lot of different products out there that have oxidizon on them. It's been in the industry for quite a while. The most common is Ronstar 2G, but a lot of distributors will also make their own products that have oxidizon on them. A really popular one in the Northeast that's widely available is the Anderson's Crabgrass and Goosegrass product. But just keep in mind that at the maximum application rate, that product is going to apply 1.5 pounds of oxidizon per acre. So we've seen that sometimes in our research that 1.5 pounds maybe doesn't provide as much control as 2 pounds. So that's something to keep in mind. I think this is, again, this product might be a good place to start if you're thinking about using oxidizon to manage goosegrass, but just keep in mind that if you don't see, the control that you'd expect, you don't see 100% control, I should say. It could be because that rate of oxidizon is not as high as we might need in this region sometimes. So you can make multiple applications potentially, but just keep that in mind. But again, I think these Ronstar products are becoming a little bit more popular. So we've talked enough, I think, about products to conclude here. These conclusions, I don't want to go through them just for the sake of time, but they'll be available to you in the handouts kind of written out here. Again, we've kind of talked about it a lot. The only thing to keep in mind with the oxidizon is that just like any other pre-emergence herbicide, if you're going to apply this in the spring, you want to keep that in mind in terms of overseeding in the fall. So part of the reason for that 2 pound recommendations is it might permit a seeding in the fall. One of the grass species that you might want to be concerned about reseeding back into is bentgrass. So bentgrass is, we need to do more research on this, but bentgrass, if you're applying this in the spring in areas where you're likely to have to reseed bentgrass, you want to be careful, and you may want to think about another herbicide. So if there are areas that flood perennially and you know you're going to have to seed bentgrass in the fall there, you might want to avoid applying the oxidizant on those areas. Ryegrass should be okay at the lower rates, but check the label for all that information. And applying to dry turf is probably a good idea. Not probably, definitely a good idea. And then you don't want to completely abandon your traditional pre-emergence if you're going to incorporate oxidizant. So we're looking at this a little bit more. But the other important thing with pre-emergence herbicides, of course, is the right timing. Probably just as important, or maybe more important than the right product, right? And so a lot of us might be thinking about pre-emergence herbicides, given that the weather's been a little bit warmer than normal for some of us. So we're wondering if the season's going to start earlier, right? So when we think about pre-emergence herbicides, we're going to typically time everything around the forsythia full bloom, and that's kind of a warning signal for crabgrass emergence. And so, a lot of us may apply our dithiopyr, protiamine, or whatever for crabgrass control at that forsythia full bloom, or maybe a little after. So the question is, if I'm going to incorporate this oxidizant into my program, when do I want to apply? So we'll talk a little bit about that, because there really are no reliable phenological indicators for goosegrass. So forsythia, obviously a reliable phenological indicator for crabgrass, but there's been nothing found for goosegrass. And so we've done a little bit of work there, so I'll talk about that. What I want to first put up here is just, when have we noted emergence in New Jersey? So we'll talk maybe a little bit about some temperature-based models in a bit, but just to get yourself kind of oriented on the calendar, my group has looked a lot at trying to model the emergence and when to help us predict when we need to apply these pre-emergence herbicides over the last few years. So basically it involves going out and counting on hands and knees at golf course fairways or at the research farm, looking for tiny little goosegrass seedlings. And so we want to know, when does that seedling first pop out of the ground, so that we have our pre-emergence herbicide out before we see that, right? So I think we've counted about 30,000 goosegrass seedlings in the past couple years, and so we're trying to, again, develop a model. But what you see here is, when did those plants first emerge? So when did we first see a goosegrass seedling pop out of the soil? Typically it was early to mid-May, and it varied a little bit by site and by year, but so early to mid-May. And if we compare this to when we saw crabgrass emergence, it was 2 to 4 weeks after we saw crabgrass emergence, or 2 to 6 weeks. So that's a good thing to keep in mind. Again, 2 to 6 weeks after crabgrass emergence, you're going to have goosegrass emergence, and it really just depends on soil temperature. About half of those seedlings that are going to emerge over the course of a season, those dates are here. So about half of those plants that typically emerge by late May, early June. And then 90% of those plants that emerged by mid-July in most cases. The thing to keep in mind, though, is that if you have areas of turfgrass that are really dense stand throughout much of the year, and then they thin out, even if it's in late August or even sometimes early September, you can have goosegrass that comes up in those areas, just because essentially that turf loss is going to release a lot of the goosegrass seedlings that hadn't been exposed to light beforehand. So really, this work is most interesting to keep in mind in terms of, when do those plants first emerge, and when do we want to have those pre-emergence out. Okay, so we've been doing a little bit of work with a company that looks at climate data and uses tries to develop models to predict pest outbreaks. This is Measure.io, and they work in turfgrass a little bit, but again, we've kind of gone from looking at a calendar-based approach to working with this company to try to develop a better model using kind of a data science approach. So we're still kind of working on that, and I don't have a really easy number to give you today, but essentially what we found is that if we get 10 growing degree days, 55F per day, once we start to get around 10 of those per day, that's when goosegrass is going to start to germinate. Of course, I know no one in here is keeping track of goosegrass, of growing degree days 55. You might be doing 50s. So that makes it a little tricky, but essentially what it boils down to is a rough estimate is, when we have a few days of air temperatures that get into the 80s, the mid 80s during the afternoon, that happens a few days in a row with good soil moisture, that's when goosegrass is going to start to germinate. So it's typically mid-May for a lot of us, and it depends on, how much turf is in the area and whatnot. So that's essentially what we found. So what that means is that for some of us that use dithiopyr and like to wait often until May to apply, which is sometimes after that crabgrass has actually emerged, when you're applying dithiopyr, it might actually be a good time to apply oxidizon for pre-emergence control, because oxidizon is not going to control plants that have emerged, even though the dithiopyr will control crabgrass plants that have emerged, right? So a lot of times we take advantage of that application flexibility with dithiopyr. That's not an option with oxidizon. So keep in mind that this weed is going to emerge goosegrass by early to mid-May. And I think that's surprising sometimes because typically goosegrass doesn't really become a problem until we get to July. Typically July 4th, the month of July and August are good for goosegrass, and so you think, well, maybe those plants germinated in June, but in reality they germinate again, as we found, in May, and they kind of hang out low in the turf canopy. They don't really develop until the soil temperatures get really warm. So you want to keep that in mind, that it really does need to be applied in mid-May. If you're not sure, you can scout bare areas near cart paths. You can think about some of the air temperature stuff we just talked about. And so, scouting is a little bit tricky when you're looking at tiny seedling plants, but here's a picture of a goosegrass plant. On the right is kind of what they look like when they first pop out of the soil down deep in the turfgrass canopy. So we're pulling apart the turfgrass canopy, and you can see these goosegrass seedlings here down pretty low. So one thing to keep in mind if we're comparing it to crabgrass seedlings is the goosegrass leaf tip, which is pictured here, is going to be on the left of the screen, is going to be more blunt than crabgrass, which I think I've got a picture of crabgrass here. So if we're comparing crabgrass and goosegrass, if you've seen crabgrass seedlings before, those leaf tips are going to be a little bit more pointed. So something you'd probably have to work and practice over time. But if you are scouting, you're worried about whether you need to apply, scout the bare areas, south-facing slopes, cart paths, and potentially look for this weed as well, in addition to thinking about air temperatures. All right, so again, the pre-emergence herbicide, whatever it is you select, needs to be applied before the weed emerges, and so typically that's early May, early to mid-May, even though we don't see goosegrass until July. All right, so that kind of covers the pre-emergence aspect of it. If there's any questions, I can take them now, or I can take them at the end. But what I want to move to now is to talk about post-emergence herbicides and the timing of those and some of the different strategies we can use, because a lot of times you may choose to just adopt a post-emergence herbicide strategy in addition to some cultural practices, or your pre-emergence program might not hold up throughout the season and you need post-emergence herbicides and that kind of thing. So we'll talk about that right after we do this poll. Oh, did I go past it? So mostly what I want to get a sense from here is what grass species everyone's working with, just so we can kind of tailor the discussion a little bit towards that. So in your fairway specifically, I want to know, because I think I have a good idea on the roughs. And we're not going to talk a lot about greens in terms of post-emergence herbicides, so because none of them are legally allowed to be applied on greens. So what species
Okay, then that's a good thing to not talk about.
Yeah. So one thing I should mention though, because I know a lot of the participants have goosegrass on their putting greens, is the only product that I mentioned earlier that's labeled for use on putting greens is that Anderson's crab and goose product. So if you have an infestation on putting greens, some of the things I often recommend are kind of managing traffic and especially managing the cleanup laps. Try not to thin that turf grass out in those cleanups too much in the summertime. The other thing I usually talk about is trying to manage the goosegrass in the putting green surrounds, because the goosegrass in the putting green probably isn't going to produce a lot of seed. So a lot of that seed for that infestation is probably coming from the surrounds. But if you do want to resort to an herbicide for use on putting greens, you can use that Anderson's crab and goosegrass product. Again, it has the oxidize on the benzolide in it, so it is registered for putting green use.
Thanks for that clarification.
All right.
Okay, here is what the poll looks like on this one.
All right, so I'm dominated by bentgrass and kind of a mix. Okay, thanks.
Absolutely.
So we talked about this in terms of pre-emergence herbicides, but
hang on just a sec, Matt. Somebody has typed in here, use a drop seed spreader with that Anderson C&G if you're applying to the greens.
Okay.
So there's a good tip.
That's probably a good recommendation. I'd say you're definitely going to want to obviously spread it as a granular. Drop spreaders are good. The only thing that, and this isn't really a problem with the Anderson's product in terms of safety, but the only thing that makes me nervous about drop spreaders is that if you overlap, you're basically applying a 2x rate where you overlap. Whereas if a rotary spreader, if you're a little off, you're not going to quite usually overlap, or you're not going to quite apply a 2x application rate. So drop spreaders are good. They're going to give you probably the most accurate application. But they're also going to make skips and overlaps more obvious. So, but yeah, that's a good point. All right, so we'll talk about timing. So
one more question. Sorry, Matt.
Oh, yeah.
What about benzolide on greens?
Yep. So benzolide is also labeled for use on greens, and that's one of the components of that Anderson's crab and goosegrass product. You can use benzolide on your putting greens. Benzolide is not going to have as much of an effect on goosegrass as the oxidize on. So now benzolide has been used safely on putting greens for many years. So the only difference is there that if you're already using benzolide and you're going to introduce oxidize on, that's a new herbicide essentially. So my recommendation when you're using a new herbicide is maybe to try it on a small area in 1 year, and that would be the same for oxidize on fairways. Try it in an area, make sure you don't have any phytotoxicity issues. But I don't hear really any issues with the Anderson's product, and definitely none with the benzolide by itself. So the only thing to keep in mind is that the benzolide is not going to be as effective on the goosegrass as the oxidize on. So you could try it. I just don't. I would not expect as much goosegrass control if comparing it to the common.
Yep. Sorry. One last follow-up question. What if it's hot outside?
What if it's what?
Hot.
Hot at the time you're applying.
Yeah.
Yeah. You definitely want to be careful as applying any herbicide when it's hot. So typically, a lot of these are going to be applied in May. As long as temperatures aren't into the 90s, it's not something I'd be concerned about. But on my putting greens and even fairways, as soon as you apply it, you want to, if you can, especially on the greens, you'd probably like to water it in. On the fairways, my recommendation is usually just to try to get it watered in before the dew the next morning, so that if you're mowing the fairways the next morning, and there's still some of those prills with the herbicide on them that haven't gotten into the canopy, you're not kind of dragging those around in the dew. But as long as it's not over 90, it should be okay.
Okay, thanks so much.
All righty. All right, so talking about post-emergence timing, the thing to keep in mind is that goosegrass, just like a lot of other weeds, is a lot easier to control when the plants are small. So if we look at seedling plant on the upper left part of this photo here, or a plant with a 2-leaf stage plant. And so when we talk about leaf stages and tiller stages, we're always counting the number of leaves. So in this case, again, this is a 2-leaf goosegrass plant right here, even though there are actually 3 leaves on it, because we don't count the initial seed leaf. So there's 2 true leaves. And on the lower left-hand corner of the screen, you've got 5-leaf plant. So these are going to be much easier to control than this 4-tiller plant. And this is going to be especially important for those of us in bentgrass, where we really can't use high rates of herbicides that control goosegrass. So Usually I get calls in August and September about goosegrass when the plants are, I'd say that point you're lucky if they're 4 tillers, or probably more like 20 tillers. So they're very difficult to control. So knowing where you have a goosegrass problem and trying to come up with a strategy to control it before we get into the heat of the summer is going to be important, because the plants are going to be smaller and you can use lower rates. My thing went away. Lisa, I don't know if it's
sorry about that.
Slides are gone. All right, so I'll try to, maybe, what did I do? All right, so there we go. So this is just kind of an example, or putting some numbers behind what I just said in terms of rates and what rate you might argue, what rate you can use to control goosegrass at different stages. So, if we're up to a 2-leaf stage, you can use Acclaim at 3.5 ounces to the acre and Pilex at 1/4 ounce to the acre. As that plant gets bigger, even going from a 2-leaf plant, which is here, to a 5-leaf plant here, that Acclaim rate is going to go from 3.5 to 13 ounces per acre in terms of the product rate that you need to get weed control. And this is all from the product label. The problem is that you cannot apply 13 ounces of Acclaim to creeping bentgrass. You can do it in your rough areas, or if you've got a mixed ryegrass fairway. But if you're in bentgrass fairways, you cannot apply high rates of Acclaim. So what a common strategy is to make frequent applications of Acclaim at low rates whenever you're applying fungicides at 3.5 ounces to the acre. I know some apply higher, but you are not allowed to apply more than 3.5 ounces to bentgrass. So you can see hopefully how it gets difficult to control this weed as those plants get bigger, especially in creeping bentgrass. Pilex is an option again in creeping bentgrass at up to 1/4 ounce to the acre, but our research has shown you won't get control of tiller stage plants from Pilex at 1/4 ounce to the acre. You will get control if you go 1/2 to 3/4 to 1 ounce of Pilex per acre. That'll control larger plants. But again, if you get behind and you get these large plants in bentgrass in the middle of the summer, you're not going to be able to apply an herbicide rate that will control the weed. All right, and then once we get to tillered plants that are in the lower right-hand corner of the screen, this is something you'd like to avoid. You're going to need multiple applications of any of these herbicides to get control. All right, so this is the low rate Acclaim program that's sometimes used. The key is if you're going to adopt one of these programs, you want to start usually around Memorial Day, because that's when the goosegrass plants have actually started to emerge out of the ground, and they're still in this relatively small stage that you've got pictured at the bottom of the screen here. Then reapplying with a fungicide program. The same is for Pilex, whether it's at 1/4 ounce per acre or lower, depending on how you like to use this in creeping bentgrass. I'm not going to get a lot into creeping bentgrass safety today, but you will have some bleaching to creeping bentgrass if you apply Pilex at 1/4 ounce to the acre. So some superintendents like to use lower rates, but the key is whatever program you want to adopt is to start around Memorial Day. Don't wait till the 4th of July or later, and then you're going to need to reapply if you don't have a pre-emergence program out there. If you're in the rough areas where you can be a little bit more economical with your programs, and maybe you can tolerate a little bit more goosegrass there, we can use higher rates of Pilex or Acclaim in these areas. So again, just to save on labor, you don't necessarily need to apply so frequently, because we can apply at high rates of Pilex up to 1.5 ounces per acre, which will that'll control large plants. The thing to keep in mind with these herbicides is that the efficacy varies a lot of times from course to course, and one of the things we've looked at is soil moisture, and found that you really need to have optimal soil moisture in order for these products to work well. So we did this in the greenhouse in collaboration with the University of Tennessee, but basically this graph is showing percent control with these different products, and we're going to focus here on the right. But if soil moisture was low, in this case less than 12%, so that's pretty low, but not uncommon in some areas on the golf course. If soil moisture was low both before and after that herbicide was applied, we got almost no control. So that would be here and here. When soil moisture was ideal, right, soil volumetric water content was greater than 20%, we get much more control. So just keep in mind, you want the plant to be actively growing. The same thing is true. We've seen these herbicides work better if they're applied with granular nitrogen fertilizer. as well. So just keep in mind you want that plant to be actively growing, whether you're making low rate applications or high rate applications of these products. So we're moving from talking about low rate programs to high rate programs. A lot of times people like to talk about tank mixtures. So we'll talk about some tank mixtures that can be used in non-bentgrass areas. So this includes roughs, but it also includes perennial ryegrass fairways, Kentucky bluegrass fairways. So Pilex plus triclopyr is commonly used sometimes to reduce the bleaching component of the Pilex herbicide a little bit. We've done a lot more work with Pilex plus Speed Zone, which we'll talk about in a second. And then Pilex plus Drive, which is quinclorac, is a good combination if you've got a lot of crabgrass, but keep in mind that quinclorac or Drive has absolutely no activity on goosegrass. So I want to talk about Speed Zone real quick. We found that it provides good post-emergence grassy weed control of goosegrass, actually, and this is on the label. So we usually think of Speed Zone as a broadleaf product, but it's actually labeled for use on goosegrass. Here's some control we found with Speed Zone. The thing to keep in mind with Speed Zone is, okay, if we're going after multi-tiller plants, so this can happen later in the summer, July and August, one application, this is the control we saw from one application here. So one application at the labeled rate is not going to provide acceptable goosegrass control. Two applications, that's here, that will provide better control, but those need to be applied on a 30-day interval, which isn't always the most practical thing. So what we've been looking at is tank mixtures of Speed Zone and Pilex, and that's pictured here. So that's the control we've seen from tank mixtures of Speed Zone at 4 pints and Pilex at lower rates. And here's some pictures of that. So these are that's one application of Speed Zone on the right. You can still see some goosegrass in there. The combination there on the left has been pretty effective for us. And so one thing I want to point out, this is not exclusive to Speed Zone and Pilex, but with post-emergence control is that you don't want to just look at control at one point in time, because this is an annual weed. And so if we get control of that weed at one point in time, if we don't have a pre-emergence down, we can have seedlings that germinate later in the summer. So say you spray in July and you get great control, well, you've still got the month of August where you're going to have seedlings that germinate likely. And that's kind of pictured here in this graph. So this is the same trial, but now we're looking at it control over time. So more control is better, higher 100% is better. But what you see is that Speed Zone plus Pilex, this is where we pulled the data from that graph. It provides excellent control, up to about 5 weeks after. But then you notice this decline here. And so what this is, we've got peak control at 2 weeks. The Speed Zone applied once starts to recover, and then you notice we get a bump if we apply Speed Zone again. And so that is basically, we're controlling seedlings that have emerged since this date where we've applied. Okay, we're getting good control here, and then all the plants that were present at the time of application are controlled here. We're getting almost 100% control. Okay, this control declines, and I'm making a mess of this graph. But this control declines because we get new seedlings that emerge, okay, not because the herbicide wasn't effective. So the bottom line here is that any post-emergence program is probably going to need multiple applications if there's not a pre-emergence program in place. The last thing I want to mention with the Speed Zone Pilex, again, this is something you can use in your cool season rough areas or non-bentgrass fairways, is that we saw that it reduced the bleaching that you see on the goosegrass from the Pilex alone. So the left side of the image here was a plot where Pilex was applied alone, and this is at 7 days after treatment. And this is pretty typical. You get that bleaching of the goosegrass, which may be kind of objectionable. When we put the Speed Zone in there with the Pilex, the control was very rapid. So at 7 days after treatment, you can see not only are there no goosegrass plants present because they've all been controlled, but there's also no bleaching going on. So we've really observed this combination almost completely eliminates the bleaching from the Pilex. So again, maybe an option in some of those rough areas. And there's some things to keep in mind there. But I'm running out of time, so I won't get into it. So the thing to keep in mind with post-emergence herbicides is that timing is everything, and don't wait too long. And the last thing I do want to mention is just really think about, and it's, you have a little bit of time in the spring to try to improve that turf grass cover, but especially in the fall, trying to take those areas that have been infested by goosegrass, whether it's through heavy traffic or whatever, try and do some aerification, apply some nitrogen to try to get turfgrass density in the spring. Because one of the things we found in that work where we looked at seedling emergence is that if you've got bare soil, you get more than 3 times as many seedlings that emerge here as you do if you've got even a halfway decent stand of turf in the fairway or the rough. So, having good turfgrass cover is going to take the pressure off those herbicides. And I would recommend, even if you have applied a pre-emergence herbicide, to aerify into it in areas that are really beaten down with traffic. If you've got areas that really goosegrass is the only thing growing, that means soil compaction is a cause of that infestation, and no pre-emergence herbicide is going to hold up if you've got completely bare soil and no turf. So really, even if you have applied a pre-emergence herbicide, you can aerify into it. If I hadn't run out of time, I was going to talk about really how the labels in some cases mention that you should not aerify after you've applied these products, but that the research over the years has shown that aerifying into a pre-emergence herbicide is not likely to affect the control that's provided, and that's really what these slides are. This is some research going back to the 80s showing that even aggressive core cultivation at pre-emergence herbicide application or 4 weeks later did not reduce the effectiveness of these various products for crabgrass control. And then the theory on why that was the case is kind of outlined in this graphic that Dr. Patton at Purdue put together. But I know we're out of time, so I won't get into it. But the bottom line is that, if the lack of turf cover is the reason you have goosegrass issues, don't be afraid to aerify if it's a high traffic area. So basically, to conclude, if you're looking at programs for control, if you've got minor infestations, you could potentially, incorporate some of those cultural practices and also rely a little bit more heavily on post-emergence herbicides. And if you've got heavy infestations, you might want to think about a pre-emergence herbicide following with a post-emergence herbicide. But the key with any of these herbicide programs is going to be to rotate modes of action and understand modes of action, because, we've got a lot of us are using Pilex or topramazone, which is an outstanding goosegrass herbicide. But if we rely on that too heavily, goosegrass has shown that it can definitely adapt to herbicides, and we might lose that at some point. So just want to rotate modes of action, whether it's pre or post emergence. And that's why that speed zone we talked about, I think, is a good thing to think about. And then that's really all I have. There's a fact sheet that I think you got sent to you for the webinar, and I'll take questions and if we have time, but I know I'm already a couple minutes over. So I really appreciate everyone taking the time to come out. You can contact me via email or Twitter or whatever if you've got questions outside of the webinar too. So that's all I have, Lisa.
Great, Matt. Wonderful job. And those handouts are available in your GoToWebinar control panel for you to download. You can do that now. We'll make them available to you. You can see the code on your screen that you will want to put into the external education affidavit on the website. That code is 999-23209-30743. And for those people who are listening in the future to the recording, put in the day you're listening. The rest of you will put in today's date. Okay, here's a long question. Any recommendations or suggestions for pre and post control of both crab and goosegrass on a heavily used bentgrass practice tee? We currently do a split dimension in spring, followed up with monthly 2% applications. Okay. So not to limit new growth of bent in the seed divot mix, but with little success. This tee gets absolutely plummeted on a daily basis. Yeah. And we ultimately spend a couple of days manually removing the weeds because it becomes too noticeable.
Sure. Yeah, good question. I didn't have the time to talk about tees a lot. And so there's a couple of things going on. Is one, you don't want to apply too much of a root pruning herbicide where you are relying on stolen growth to fill in those divots. And two, the effectiveness of those pre-emergence herbicides is going to be reduced because, when you remove a giant divot, you're removing some of that pre-emergence herbicide. So that's one of the challenges there. 2% is not going to inhibit root growth, and it's the quandary with 2% is that it's a lot more effective on crabgrass than it is on goosegrass. So it's not going to be as effective. It still might be a good option to manage crabgrass. Oxidizon might be worth a try in smaller areas because actually it does not inhibit root growth. So the stolons will still be able to root through an oxidizon treated area. And you'll still likely see that it'll work better than no pre-emergence herbicide applied alone, even though you've got those divots. So that might be something to try in a small area. Oxidizon is used a lot in the southeast, especially on Bermuda grass athletic fields, specifically for the reason that it doesn't inhibit rooting. So that's something to think about. The other thing to think about might be if you can get out there with post-emergence herbicides, topramazone or Pilex application would be a good place to start. Making applications hopefully, starting around early June, and if you can apply, when you're treating your fairways with fungicides on that sort of interval, that would be where I would probably look to. And you may be able to apply less frequently with the Pilex because if you're worried about the bleaching, if you've got a pre-emergence herbicide out there, you're able to use a little bit of scouting to try to see how this, see if you really need to apply every 3 weeks. It's going to be one of those things you'll have to sort of try something this year and see how well it works. And then if it doesn't work that well, change it a little bit for next year. But for the T at large this year, I would think about either an Acclaim or a Pilex program. Pilex has a little bit more activity at rates that's labeled in bentgrass, so that's why I recommend starting there. But if the bleaching is objectionable, then you could either reduce your application frequency. Some superintendents put triclopyr in there at really low rates, but that can cause injury to bentgrass sometimes and stunt it a little bit, so that's not a perfect solution either. But I guess if I had to pick one thing, I would start with Pilex and maybe try a little bit of oxidizon on the side, and then always keep a non-treated area too to see how these programs are working. So I hope that helps.
I think it does. Thank you. We have a webinar the 24th of March, Effective Control of Anthracnose in Turfgrass, presented also by PBI-Gordon. If you miss new fungicides in the new year, Jim Kearns taught that for us last month, and that's available now as an on-demand. Our next live webinar, Armed Intruders, What You Need to Know Now by Rick Capozzi. Any difference in post-efficacy by goosegrass morphology? Anecdotally seems the dwarf ecotypes in lower heights of cut seem harder to control.
Yeah, great question. Different biotypes, ecotypes. That is a question we don't really have the answer to, but it is likely a source of variable results, variable efficacy with some of these herbicides. The one thing we do know is that goosegrass is capable of producing different ecotypes, and actually those characteristics are passed down from generation to generation. So Scott McElroy at Auburn did some of that work. Yeah, there probably are likely differences, and that's gonna, it's definitely gonna be one of those things where that's why I'm not gonna be able to provide a cookbook necessarily for how to control this because of all these variables. So no, I don't have any good information on how the biotype might affect herbicide efficacy. I also suspect it affects when germination occurs. Some biotypes might germinate earlier than later, but we haven't figured that out yet. But we saw pretty big differences in when goosegrass germinated at our different golf course sites that we looked at a couple years ago. So I think it's a good question, probably needs some more work done.
Well, and I think too, Matt, that points to some of the record keeping, the importance of having that information, that you track information about those germinations, that, some of the kinds of things that you've done in the research to, and as you said, test on an area and keep track of what has happened there, so that you aren't just, as the question says, anecdotally, you have a little bit more history there to go on.
Yeah, I don't. If you've got a lot of goosegrass, you're probably not going to solve the issue in 1 year. So trying to just get a little better every year and try new things is a good strategy. And yeah, like you mentioned with the germination, that the models that we've developed are hopefully more of a guide, and you can use them as a guide, but also scout a little bit, just like you would with seed heads. We're having a weird spring, so those growing degree day models might not hold up all that well. And so using the growing degree day models as a guide, but also kind of using your knowledge of agronomy and plants to sort of think about what should I be doing this year when we have a weird year? Maybe I should apply a little earlier or whatever. What's happened this winter so far is not going to have an effect on goosegrass, I wouldn't suspect. But if the trend continues, and we have a warm spring, it might germinate earlier. So, but yeah, good questions. Any other questions?
That is the last that I'm seeing. Do you have any closing remarks for us, Matt?
No, I don't think so. I have a lot more I could talk about, but we got to fit it into an hour. So hopefully that was
okay. Hang on now. People have typed more stuff in. It seems to me that the goosegrass infestation started the spring after Hurricane Sandy in New Jersey.
Okay.
That's interesting.
Yeah, I've heard that a lot about Kalinga too. I don't know. I wasn't here for that, so it's weird because I heard the same thing about Kalinga, but neither of those seeds are going to be wind blown, or maybe, possibly the flooding moves some things around. I'm not really sure. I don't know why that could be, I guess, because I've heard the same thing about some of the other weeds we're having more problems with.
Okay, so, this one is, we have goosegrass. It's dormant currently in the greens from the season before. What would be the best approach to ridding the goosegrass currently in dormant greens?
In dormant greens, so I guess we're talking about cool season greens is what I'm assuming. And the thing so you've got dormant greens. The thing you might still have a chance to do is, if the plants are there, you could remove them if that's a feasible option, because the seed actually might not all have dropped off, so it might not be a complete waste of time to remove them. But the biggest thing I'd do is probably think about adopting a pre-emergence program in those areas, because there are no post-emergence herbicides labeled on putting green. So utilizing that Anderson's product. Some superintendents have told me they apply it to the approaches and then just the edges of the putting green where goosegrass is more of a problem, and don't apply it to the middle of the putting green. I think the other thing is managing those areas where it's most problematic, if they're thinner areas, or a lot of times I see goosegrass in the cleanup passes, because those get more stress just because of more mowing, and they're likely to thin out in midsummer when goosegrass is going to be a problem. So I'm trying to manage that as much as you can, and then hopefully that pre-emergence herbicide would be a good option for you, applied probably mid to late May, and try to see if that helps. And again, like Lisa, you mentioned, trying to take notes, and when you do this stuff, just try to leave a check plot somewhere so you have an idea of how well if you tried something new, how well did it work, even if it's just a few feet long or whatever. So yeah, I would start with that Anderson's crab product, and also trying to manage the traffic. And if you've got a lot of labor right now, you could even pull the plants out if the seeds are still attached, but that's not going to take care of it by itself. So I would prioritize the hand pulling pretty low on the list, but think about the pre-program, and if there's anything you can do to manage the stress in the areas where it's problematic. But good question.
After the plant has been sprayed with Pilex and it's bleached out and dying, are the seeds still viable?
Okay, that's another good question we don't have a good answer to. So if you apply an herbicide to a plant that's flowering or producing seed, are you reducing the viability of those seeds? And that's another good question we don't have an answer to. No one's looked at it. It probably reduces the viability of some of the seeds, but maybe not all of them. And it depends, how long ago they flowered and that kind of thing. And maybe even ecotypes. So I guess the answer is maybe, but I wouldn't count on it.
Okay. Well, thanks for the answers you did provide to us today, Matt. We appreciate it. Those of you who are still in the audience, we appreciate you joining us. As you exit today, you will see a survey. We'd appreciate your input, your feedback, and hope to see you all online again soon. Have a great day, everybody.